You're listening to the Christian Ghetto Podcast. I'm delighted to bring to you another episode of the Christian Ghetto Podcast, and it is my distinct pleasure to have with us today Jeremy Carl. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Yeah, well, this conversation, you know, as many of these things do these days, arose in a group chat, and it's one of those things. Israel, Zionism, the Palestinian question, all of these things kind of swirl around. There has been some recent, I think Chris Rufo and someone else got into it on the internet, and again, everybody's talking about these things, and we were talking about it in our group chat, and then somebody says, "Hey, just remember, Jeremy's Jewish," and it's like, "Yeah, but he's also a Christian," and I'm like, and then somebody said, "Well, maybe he, suggested, hey, Jeremy, would you tell your story?" And I thought, hey, why don't I have Jeremy on to tell his story of a transition from being part of the Jewish community to becoming a Christian. So I'm just going to leave it up to you, Jeremy, where to start. And thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And I think just to get the facts completely correct, I think I was the one who added myself, just because I knew that, I don't know, you never know with those group chats, kind of who knows what about whom. And I didn't want anybody to feel like they needed to pull their punches because I was there, because I would somehow be offended because my identification is ultimately as a Christian. And I kind of have, as I said, I'm sort of probably to the right of even a lot of people on the group chat on some of these Jewish Christians. So that's how I think it came discussion. But yeah, I mean, I don't know wherever you want to start. But I guess maybe my own background, I sort of grew up in a very secular Jewish family that had been in the U.S., depending on the relatives, from the 1840s, 1880s. So, a little bit longer than some of their families, and kind of pretty well assimilated into the American mainstream. And kind of growing up in North Carolina, I actually knew kind of Billy Graham's great nieces pretty well, the close friends of my sister. And so, sort of had a fair bit of exposure to Christianity, and not a particularly large amount of religious exposure to Judaism, although I certainly some. And just over time, didn't really think a lot about religious or spiritual issues until maybe I got to college. I thought about them a little bit, but not in any serious way. And then I went to Yale as an undergrad, and this is all literally decades before I became a Christian. And but what I even discovered at that time is I was fortunate, and this was not necessarily that common. I had two roommates in particular who were Christians, and do a few Bible studies. And what I kind of felt like is, in the kind of rat race of Yale, the Christians there were the only people who really had what I felt a kind of healthy perspective on the entire thing. Maybe just what was going to be their next step on the leadership ladder, but to something a little bit more. And so at that time, I began to sort of pay a little bit more attention to, the gospel, and kind of really, I'd say the first step for those of you who are looking to convert Jews or others, but I think maybe even particularly for Jews, because I think a lot of Jews, although this would not have been as much the case in my own particular case, resistant directly evangelized, and we can talk about why that is. But for me, I think probably the first evangelism was just sort of seeing the actual of Christians, and understanding, of course, that there are people who are nominally Christian who behave in abominable ways, just like all different backgrounds behave in abominable ways. And I'm actually a member of the PCA and a Calvinist, so I would be the first to about our inherent sinfulness, even for the good ones of us, with all those provisos out of the way. I mean, the first thing that really attracted me to Christianity was seeing the kind of good behavior of Christians that seemed differentiated from the secular people around me. And then, there were kind of a lot of long stories in the intermediate, and I got into after college a little bit for various reasons, and I was occasionally attending church in Seattle, and then I ended up marrying a Christian, somebody who was somebody from a mainline background, but for whom took it like enough ago. We're talking about the early 2000s, that she still took Christianity seriously, kind of growing up in the 1980s in a mainline Presbyterian church. Just things kind of happened over the years. I frequently go we got married and we had 5 kids, and I would go to church, and we decided we were going to raise them as Christians. And I would go to church sometimes with the family, but not all the time, for a variety of reasons. My wife, because she's not particularly theologically oriented, had sort of taken them to a more liberal Congregationalist church because it had good music, and she's really into music. And because I wasn't a Christian, I didn't feel like I got the kind of veto power over, what type of church we were attending. But I think that kind of set me back a little bit. I mean, I was never evangelized. In the entire years I was on the outskirts of that church, nobody ever tried to people welcomed me, fine, but nobody really tried to make me into a Christian. But there were various things that kind of happened in the intervening years, and cultural things, political things, religious things. I began to read and I kind of remember, I think the first step, maybe, or not the first step, but there was a kind of step, and I was listening to a pastor preach for the Good Friday service, mentioned Matthew 3 is maybe not the world's most famous verse. I mean, maybe it is. I mean, obviously it depends on how literate you are from a Christian perspective. But for me, as a Jewish person at the time, it made a big impact, because it said, effectively, you kind of are taking pride in the fact that you're children of Abraham, but even from these stones, God could make children to Abraham. And for somebody who had a sense of like this ethnic identity that was kind of holding me back in some way, it kind of realized, there's really nothing privileged about that, or that should keep you from sort of doing the right thing. That sort of planted a seed. It took a while for that to fully sprout, but then many years later, when I was kind of reading the Bible, I asked that again, and it just made an impact. And I decided, I kind of considered myself a Christian, although I didn't get baptized yet for a variety of reasons. And then a variety of things happened, and we ended up, I'd been a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, but I decided that we needed to leave California because it just wasn't in line with the social and political environment I wanted to raise my kids in. And so we moved to Montana, which was much more sort of friendly territory for that. And I decided at that point, even though I had not been baptized yet, that I still, I kind of considered myself a Christian at that point, and that I was going to choose a church that I felt like was going to be really serious about the gospel and Jesus and the stakes that we should play for as Christians. And so I found a really good PCA church out here, and we started attending, and I was baptized actually in that church. And that's kind of the executive summary of the story of my Christian journey. There's a lot I obviously left out of ups and downs, but that's kind of the quick summary. A lot of time and a lot of thought and prayer that went into it.
It's interesting that you say, you're in a Calvinist tradition, because it's funny for many of us who grew up in the church, were baptized as Christians, that your journey doesn't somehow seem as unfamiliar to many of those that I know, where it just, born in the church and then kind of went through a period of doing your own thing. You're even attending church on Sunday, a lot of times, ins and outs. And then finally at some point, something clicks, and I can't really pick a moment, but all of a sudden I knew this is who I am, what I believe. And then from then on out, it was a serious part of their life. You know, it just seems to happen a lot. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think there may be some difference even between me. I mean, everybody had a conversion story, but even me and other Jewish Christianity, and a lot of them had maybe been grown up more steeped in Jewish tradition. And they kind of really, it's almost in a Saul on the road to Damascus becoming Paul type of way. And it's a sort of more dramatic kind of situation. Whereas for me, kind of getting almost at what you're saying, in some ways, I don't want to overstate it, but I was kind of growing up in this culturally Christian environment. You know, my family was not the kind of New York Jewish family that you'd like see on like Seinfeld or something, or some, you know, sitcom. I mean, we were kind of like very Midwestern, Middle American folks, you know, maybe like a fair bit more intellectual and whatnot because of the Jewish background or whatever else, or maybe a slightly different sense of humor. But I think, you know, I was growing up in the Bible Belt in a place in which that was kind of the default. And so that's maybe why the story does sound a little bit more similar to others who even nominally grew up in the church. But it's been really gratifying for me that my kids, you know, they range between 8 and 18, but they've really, they're, I mean, obviously many years to stray, but they take it seriously, and I think they're following the right path. And that's really gratifying as a parent to see and embracing what we're trying to give them.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I have my 19-year-old is away at college, and like our church has only one service a day, but the church that he's been attending near there, and he's going to the same university as his aunt and uncle, and that's the church they recommended to him, and he's going there. And all of a sudden we get a message, you know, they have 2 services, Dad. I'm going to the second service now twice, you know. So unbidden, all on his own, makes up his own mind. He's now going to 2 services. And you're thinking, like, how awesome does that get? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, my son really wants to, he's a sophomore in high school. He wants to go to Covenant College, which is the PCA's kind of, you know, sort of college down in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And, you know, who knows? But I mean, he's really looking at places like Covenant and Wheaton, and, you know, he goes to that, or whether he's going to, you know, an academically selective secular school of some sort, just knowing that that's kind of where his head at is really gratifying.
It's very nice. Now, the next question, I guess, is, and I think this was where it kind of came up in the group chat, is this idea that how Jews, both religious and secular, perceive Christians, and then the Christian perception of how they think Jews do perceive them or should perceive them. And I think there's a lot of expectations from a lot of Christians, especially those who are supportive of the state of Israel, who have, you know, learned the lessons of the Holocaust, all of these kind of things, that I think deep down they feel like you guys should be a whole lot more grateful, you know, that sort of thing. And I think they're surprised to understand that both secular and religious Jews have very different feelings about Christians than Christians think that they should have. And that how Christians think, you know, in many ways, how many Christians feel towards the Jewish people.
Yeah. So I should kind of, because as we're going to now start talking about it as a whole, rather than just my own experience, I kind of feel I have a pretty big disclaimer that probably will help me with any bad actors who happen to listen. But obviously, everything I say is going to be a generalization. It's not going to be true of it won't even necessarily be true of most Jews that I'm talking about, but we're trying to talk in realities of these. Anytime I say something bad, I'm obviously not talking about every bad, you know, Jewish person being bad in some way. Conversely, every time I say something good, I'm not talking about every person. So I have to do that throat clearing, because we're going to get into some sensitive territory. And
Sure.
I do, you know, I still have, of course, with my family of origin, and a lot of friends who are Jewish. So I want to be respectful of that. But yeah, I mean, actually, the kind of reaction that you're describing from Christians, I think, maybe kind of reflects your own community and the community of listeners, because I actually think I understand why Christians would feel that way, but I actually feel like I kind of feel like the mainline Christian perspective is to be not expecting as much out of Jews as I feel like they probably should, and you know, being very reluctant to criticize Jews or Jewish communal behavior, even when, in my view, that might be very warranted. And so I think that's actually environment, and then degree to which this gets kind of caught up in Christian Zionism and Christian dispensationalism, and those are both things that I just from a theological perspective, and I say that not because I'm actually, from a secular perspective, not hostile to the state of Israel. Again, I mean, I'm a bad representative of anybody here, because I'm, you know, I decline to kind of be radical on any of these questions. You know, I kind of feel vaguely positively disposed to Israel because, you know, I've been to Israel. I've been to a lot of its neighbors. I think Israel is a more pleasant place for the average American to hang out. It's, you know, it has certain cultural things I do like about it in terms of its value of education and science and technology and things like that. But of course, you know, there's plenty to criticize in the government of Israel as well. And I kind of reject any of the theological trappings that some Christians put around Israel, because I think that ultimately the church is Israel, and I'm not for that kind of, there's a continuing special covenant relationship with the Jews that is kind of outside of the church, my logical understanding. And I'm not an expert theologian, as you'll see if you query me deeply, but that's at least my discernment of those issues right now. And I think Christians tend to see Jews, and speculating here, if you look at the survey data, you'll see Christians see Jews overall quite positive light. Now, maybe not, in certain segments, if you go far enough right, you'll see that, but that's what the data shows. Whereas Jews tend to see particularly evangelical Christians in a very negative light, which is something I don't think that evangelical Christians have as much of a appreciation. And I frankly think it reflects poorly on the Jewish community, even though I understand it to a degree. I mean, where it comes from is, you have this idea, and the only people who stick around the Jewish community are ultimately very connected to that project, because there's always a lot of pressure historically. I mean, it's only in the 21st century where you sort of, it's maybe starting in the mid 20th century that you didn't have pressures societally to convert. So you have people with a fair bit of stubbornness about that, and I think you tend to be very skeptical of. They're scared. Well, when Christians together, they feel like that's not going to work very well for Jews. And again, I mean, I'm critical of this attitude for a variety of reasons, but I'm just trying to explain it. I mean, I do think there's obviously historical things that you can point to, and unless Hitler is always the convenient, kind of bad example for today for many reasons, but Hitler wasn't really a Christian in any way other than the most nominal sense that he felt like he needed to run a Christian country at the time. But if you go back to, the 19th or early 20th century, if you get things that your listeners may be more familiar with, like the Dreyfus Affair in France, which really were sort of spearheaded by the church, and for which the Jewish community not wind up in a great place as a result, or pogroms or things like that. So, I mean, in those things, I do, even though I'm critical of the Jewish community's negative attitude toward evangelical, have been incredibly helpful on a lot of issues, including the state of Israel, which these same Jews claim to care about. I kind of understand. I'm not the historical reason why I think there's some of this skepticism And then I think there are things beyond that, but I think that's kind of the core of it.
And that, I think, largely is sort of bears out in my experience too. There's just, like you say, there's that long history to Christianize and to just sort of abandon those religious and ethnic roots and just sort of integrate into Christian society. And then there's just the long history of Christian pogroms, the money lending, so guys, lords would finance their wars. And then when they couldn't pay the bill, it was easier just to do a pogrom. I get why people sort of begin to develop long-seated hard feelings over that.
Right. But at the same time, right, it goes in the other direction because Jews found themselves and ultimately decided to participate. Now they were, of course, limited in the sorts of careers that they could choose in many cases in Christian Europe going back, but they were often the kind of oppressive power out there. So they can't be surprised that, the average descendant of a Cossack peasant might be resentful to them historically for some of that. So, I think a lot of how I think about Judaism from that perspective, from a historical perspective, has been, and this maybe explains the differing attitudes of Jews to evangelicals as opposed to evangelicals or Catholics or whatever you have to Jews, is Jews have often loved to play the victim rather than accept that they are participants in history. That means that at times, of course, they've been victims, but they're also can be perpetrators. And, that they've things that Christians didn't like and that weren't, were not Christian behavior, for lack of a better term. And so that will cause, understandably, resentment among the Christian community as well. And so, I think it's inevitable, of course, that people will always sort of take their own side, historical quarrel. The Jewish community is kind of done to a unusual extent, and there's also an extent to which Holocaust kind of dominates so much of modern Jewish thinking, even today. And almost every history is kind of Holocaust history read backwards within the Jewish community. And I think it's very unhealthy. And I'm reading things now that New York Times just had a big piece about, the third generation Holocaust survivor or whatever, literature. And, to be fair to the Times article, it did kind of note that some ironic distance here. But look, for the people who survived it, of course, they can and should tell their story. They went through something very traumatic. And even for their kids, I mean, if you ever read like Mouse, the comic by Art Spiegelman that won a Pulitzer Prize, that's kind of about him growing up as the son of a survivor, kind of traumas that were inflicted by his own parents' damage. Okay, that's obviously not the same as, everybody's parents have some traumas, but that's a pretty severe one, and you can understand that. But now when you're getting to this next generation, everybody has traumas in their past, right? Like, how much are we going to kind of relitigate them? And it's sort of, there's a level of involvement there that I kind of find a little distasteful. But, obviously it's a subject.
Well, and that's it's an interesting point in a sense, the power of these stories and their ability to persist. Because you're right, with every subsequent generation, the stories lose their energy and they lose their power. And then in that regard, older dynamics perhaps begin to rear their heads, or the things that you've been leaning on to, claim special victim status. And when the energy around special victim status begins to dissipate, people begin to note, as you say, that maybe you're not actually acting as the victim, but you're the perpetrator. And this is, I think, especially in regards to the state of Israel, the kind of things that people are noting now, that like, okay, like how long are you going to rest on the Holocaust based upon how you're treating the Palestinians? Like, there's only so far you can carry that game out.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I think that's true. And again, and I say that as somebody who is not particularly sympathetic overall to the pro-Palestinian narrative. I do think that that's of course true. Like there needs to be some self-awareness that you can't be on the Holocaust, to totally disclaim the involvements of Israel and the Palestinians. So I do think that that's in and of itself a problem. But, I think this all combines with a variety of things. And Jews love to see themselves as oppressed. And again, speaking generally, I want to stress there's all sorts of, I've known many, many Jews in my life of all descriptions and many who would totally reject, right? But speaking communally, and in a society in America that has not oppressed Jews for the most part, and this kind of goes back to George Washington, even writing very nice letters to the Hebrew community of Newport, Rhode Island. So back at the beginning of our founding as a country, Jews have not been oppressed here, and as a whole, and they're very powerful in society. Again, and I'm not making we can talk about why conspiracy thinking is often kind of dumb. But this is not conspiracies. It's just like, look at the percentage of billionaires in America. It's like 30% Jewish. You look at pretty much any, politics, whatever, Jews are very overrepresented. And so we can talk later about, why that is. And I'm happy to give my thoughts on it. But kind of this notion that sort of Jews are the downtrodden here just doesn't really match with actual reality. And so, I understand why this type of kind of attitude can cause resentment among some Christians who observe it. Because I personally, even when I was Jewish, I found it distasteful.
And that, I think, maybe this is the perfect segue into that, because I have there's a number of different layers to this whole question. I think the question that I threw your direction before we in preparation was, why do you think such wild conspiracy theories surround the Jewish people? And one of those is in regards to their success in politics and business. And I've made the case in regard to the whole question of, are we being controlled by a cabal of oligarchs, or is it just basically the system set up as the system? And I generally tend to lead to, much of what we see today is not the result of a cabal of oligarchs, although oligarchs have a certain power and influence, but really the system has really been set up. And as a people, now every different ethnos and so forth have their own strengths and weaknesses. And it just seems that, from my perspective, that Jewish people are particularly adept at surviving in the world that we've built right now. And I guess that, and you can like it or lump it, but that's kind of the way that I see it. I don't know if that really confirms, from your perspective in that regard.
Yeah, I think this is true. There's actually an argument made. There's a book, The Jewish Century, by Yuri Slezky, who was a scholar at UC 20 years ago. And he's half Jewish himself, but he kind of makes this argument about Jews and modernity, and he's the only person who made it. But he was sort of surprisingly, he got a little bit canceled for it, but he didn't get that canceled for it. And it's kind of interesting because it makes, sort of arguments along the lines of what you just made. And I think, regarding the conspiracies, look, I was never invited to any of this, I can tell you, right? So,
and you went to Yale.
I think simpler. Not that, Jews absolutely do, as every group does, but I think more than some groups engage in intense communal behavior in certain respects. There's definitely a feeling of you're in or you're out. And, I think this is why it's particularly fraught when you leave, and why. If I had not grown up, I would have become a Christian probably 15 years before I did. Because I knew that with my family that wouldn't really care that much, that it would just, with family, with other people, it was just going to be, I had to be pretty darn sure, because the stakes were very high in a way that I think non-Jews wouldn't realize. But just, to kind of give an example, in any observant Jewish family's home, the traditional mode, if a child converted to Christianity, you said the mourner's Kaddish over them, which is a prayer to the dead. They were dead to you at that point, and you had no more interactions with them.
Wow.
And that happens. It happens even today, but it even happened in the mainstream well into the 20th century. And again, I always have to be careful here, because this is not, if you know some pretty secular Jewish guy, on the streets of Minneapolis or whatever, his parents are not going to likely do that. But if they're, Orthodox, even like say a Ben Shapiro modern Orthodox, they would. Again, I can't speak for Ben, personally on that question, but that would be certainly my understanding of how they behave. So there's just a lot of stakes when you leave the Jewish community. I think the kind of more simple to pivot back, well, why are all these Jews sort of at the top if there's no conspiracy? I think that the kind of way to look at it, Doug Wilson kind of has an interesting book on the Jews in which he refers to them as a high performance people. Doug actually has a little bit of Jewish ancestry himself, which was kind of interesting. And that's sort of, he sort of says, well, when they're good, they're very good. And when they're bad, they're very, very bad. And I think as a simplification, that's part of it. If you want to get more mathematical, and there actually is, there have been some people who looked at this, but basically to take Ashkenazi Jewish IQ, and, we can get into all sorts of discussions about validity of this construct. But let's just, assuming for a second, it's actually pretty well regularized. So it's maybe a standard deviation, maybe a little bit less above kind of the American average. And then if you look at American Jewish political motivation, I mean, this is a little more difficult to get on, but if you look at the percent of Jews who are donating to political candidates or, involved in politics in some way, this also kind of ends up, be a standard deviation more than the average non-Jewish white person out there. And if you add those two kind of things together, this is just like, it's literally just a math question of bell curves, right? You can wind up with, as you do when you add one bell curve and then you kind of add the other bell curve on top of that, with population that's 2.5% of the population that is giving, as is often the case, like half of the Democratic Party's top donors are Jewish, right? Like, this is how you can wind up with these numbers, or similarly, that X percent of your college professors, or these high, you get these high percentages just as a matter of math. And I'm not saying that there are not communal favoritism or other things that could come into play here, or I'm not trying to absolve. I mean, I'm very critical of overall the political stance and the sociology of the Jewish community, particularly in the century. I mean, I think it's been very destructive overall. But I don't think that that's a result of a conspiracy. I think it's a result of just, the simplest explanations are usually best. And that's a pretty simple explanation that gets you most of the way there to understanding why Jews are so overrepresented in certain types of areas, for good or for bad,
Yeah. So I guess that actually then maybe provides the next segue. That one of the things that people have observed is that there's a significant portion of the Jewish community that is left-leaning, but left-leaning in certain areas, like very, very high support for mass immigration, very, very high support for abortion. And like, even there was a recent thing on Twitter where like one of the principals at Pornhub, Jewish, like Jewish rabbi apparently, which just that kind of blew my mind. Right. And so like, but people will note these kind of things of like, and then they ask the question, like, okay, I get this, but like, what's with Jews and radical liberalism and all of these seemingly self-destructive policies and behaviors? Like, don't they see it, or is there something more malign there? And I think that's the question that then gets asked.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's an interesting, and I'll just say there's into Jewish intellectual history in kind of interesting ways. And there's a very distinguished Jewish scholar, a religious scholar, in the late 20th century. And this is interesting because it actually really deals into the problem of looking for the Messiah in the wrong place. And he was named Gershom Scholem. And again, this is a very mainstream guy. This is not some weird, I mean, a very, very highly respected. He wrote a book called Sabbati Zevi, Mystical Messiah. Now, if you're not versed in Jewish studies, that's not a name that is likely to mean anything to you. But he was the kind of principal in what was probably the singularly most significant Jewish religious movement, maybe Hasidism, of the last several hundred years. He was a guy, and I believe I'm going to get the years wrong roughly, but like in 17th century Turkey. And he declares himself the Messiah, and he gets all sorts of followers who go, follow him. And this causes huge ruptures in the established Jewish community throughout Europe, as like there are these Sabbatians and anti-Sabbatians. And again, I don't want to get too deep into this particular book there, but I think the point that Scholem makes in the book is essentially there's a deeply messianic character in Judaism from a religious perspective, that they're always looking for this Messiah. It's almost the definition of Judaism religiously is you're still looking for it. In other words, you actually found it, but that's not something that Jews are willing to hear. And because they're kind of looking in this messianic way, they are more susceptible, and this is essentially Scholem's argument, to political radicalisms of all sorts of types and political ultra enthusiasms. And so this is why you see Jews as, kind of going between Marxism and Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century. There are these Jews who, they've been growing up in a religious community that, at least until the mid-19th century, is overall kind of really radically fundamentalist for the most part. Again, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but not too much. I mean, if you're Jewish of European background, your ancestors going back a couple hundred years certainly would be considered very radical fundamentalists by the standards of time. Everything is within your community. And so, Paul Johnson, in his History of the Jews, Paul Johnson, I believe a Catholic author, definitely Christian, kind of explores this a little bit. So you have the Jewish Enlightenment, and they burst onto all this energy as they're kind of released from this religious fundamentalism that they've been very familiar with, but they don't lose that religious fundamentalist instinct. They just begin to apply it to different things. So it applies to, left-wing politics in some way, or it applies to Zionism in certain ways. And the kind of self-congratulatory way of talking about that among kind of modern, more secular Jews who still at least engage in the religious community to some degree is to say, oh, well, we care so much about tikkun olam, as they would call it, which is kind of healing the world and social justice. But I think that's a little bit too self-congratulatory. I think it's, from a Christian perspective, I just see it as misplaced religious impulse. And I mean, this was, again, kind of when I realized this is one of the steps on my path of being a Christian, that they were really searching for the Messiah that had actually been found, and that this led to a huge amount of social and political disorder within the Jewish community because they had gotten that question wrong.
That I tend to be like you, Jeremy, where I try, we're engaged in radical politics because of where we are relative to the mainstream, but I don't always, I don't like to see myself as sort of given to conspiracy theories and radicalism, and looking for a common cold explanation like that really does make a lot of sense. That you take this impulse of, your refusal to embrace Christ, to embrace Jesus as the Messiah. You still have that problem of you're waiting for the Messiah, and then it just you begin to act out over the centuries in various ways. Like, as you say, especially in the 1800s, when you're released from a very conservative community, and then you look at the list of philosophers, Enlightenment philosophers that were Jewish, and then, like you say, Karl Marx and others. Yeah. And a lot of that then makes sense, Tikkun Olam, I've heard of that, healing the world. But then again, human progress itself becomes a form of messianic or like utopian thinking. I mean, that's one of the devolutions from Christianity as well, too, the immanentizing the eschaton. As Christianity lost some of its grip on culture, people translated some of those, eschatological impulses of waiting for Christ to then, building the eschaton here on earth. So you can see similar dynamics also in the Christian community. Right. And then if you look at it, and then in some ways, maybe from the outside, you can then stand back and go, well, some of that seems very, very malign. And then, and like a lot of things, there's both, abortion, others, but then, when you're sort of chasing the dream of the merchant classes, and it can be one of those things, and you're very, very good at it. There's a lot of opportunities if you don't have a lot of scruples. And so if you find yourself a high achieving Jew with not a lot of scruples, there's plenty of opportunities to make money out there.
Yeah, no, I think that can be true. But, I'd also note, within the Christian community, we have this problem too with the social gospel and liberation theology within the Catholic Church. And, this has all led to me to like profound destruction of actual Christianity and the destruction of the mainline church, which I think has been a tragedy. Again, they tried to immanentize the eschaton. They looked for their Messiah in everywhere but Jesus, even while they were nominally paying lip service to Jesus. And it had, predictably destructive consequences as a result. And the question have been disproportionately, I just say this, look, as a conservative without apology. I mean, Jews have been disproportionately represented by a lot in some of the worst political movements of the 20th century, and obviously, or 21st century as well. That doesn't mean, no person, should be collectively responsible. Like I was not responsible for the fact that some other Jew somewhere was doing something that I totally disapproved of and didn't like. I mean, they're responsible for that, not me. So I'm not trying to pin all the blame on everyone in the community, but still that observation was there and it was observed. And, again, I understand. I mean, I look at it, and again, I even looked at it this way before I became a Christian, because I was alienated from the Jewish community for a lot of these secular reasons before I never made the mistake. I think one of the few things maybe I did really well on my religious journey is I never confused the step of being alienated from the Jewish religion and Jewish community in certain ways with whether or not I was a Christian, which is a question of whether you believe in Christ, Lord and Savior. And there were many years in between taking those two steps. So, but I was a long way of saying, I mean, I was very critical of a lot of these elements of the Jewish community, even when I was still nominally, and that hasn't changed since I've become a Christian. It also hasn't gotten any more. I mean, my objections to them, the behavior of those folks is I mean, there are some religious elements to it in the ways that we discussed, but part of it is just, secularly, hey, you guys are spearheading a lot of bad causes, right? But, the other side is, can be flipped, and that there are even the minority of Jews or conservative. There are a lot of very effective Jewish conservatives out there doing good things, even though I am also critical, kind of the neoconservatives, and are hugely critical as kind of a movement within conservatism. But I mean, I think, I think it's a long way of saying these questions are complicated. And at the end of the day, it's fine and good and reasonable to notice patterns, but people should be treated as individuals. I am responsible for my own sin, which is really quite grievous, to be sure. But I don't need to be taking on the weight of everybody else in the world with whom I happen to carry a historical or ethnic tie, because Jesus takes that away from us. That's away from us.
And I do think, again, like maybe for my listeners too, just to reiterate, I think this is a really good way to, like, as you framed it, a good way to understand that when you have a group of people that are like a standard deviation in multiple environments, both education, they're good at business, they have a high degree of political engagement, and you overlay those things, that when you have bad actors, you're going to have a greater percentage of Jewish bad actors, like quote unquote, the rabbi who's part owner of Pornhub, you know what I mean? Like these types. And so you're going to have these bad actors, and then to then,
I'd be surprised to hear that's true. Maybe it is. It's not impossible.
Yeah, it's just, it kind of like shocked me, He's got I don't know what they call it. He's got the little cap on the back, and he's doing interview. And I'm like, is this really a thing, right? But so it's one of those things where building a conspiracy theory from that, I think, is just, you end up misunderstanding the dynamic of what's going on. And this we live in an age where we have a system that advantages people with that kind of standard deviation in intelligence and ability, in those types of abilities, but then also their willingness to engage. So you combine those two in a managerial system. And, even though you represent, like you say, 2.5% of the population, sometimes you're looking at 30-40% of the high achievers in certain sectors. And that's, and it's not because they're running some sort of, it's just Skulls organization or something behind the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to totally, I want to totally reject the strong conspiratorial theorizing. It's just not true. I can tell you, like I would have known about it. But at the same time, I think Jews are very communal. I don't want to underplay that. And so I think that kind of also enhances it. It also makes it a little more difficult once you kind of leave the community in a public way, which I obviously did. So that is a piece of it. It's just not the biggest piece of it. And there is no elders of Zion, out there, dreaming up protocols. I think I shared this again in our group chat, right? It's like, I'm writing a book right now as a follow-up to my book on anti-white racism. It's kind of looking at the white left and how destructive they are. And I have a chapter on this that I'm going to the kind of role of Jewish white leftists, because I think it's something that has to be talked about in a respectable but honest way, because I think it's important. But in kind of thinking about that chapter and reading it, every time the Groypers open their mouths online, and for those of your listeners, this is kind of like this young, sort of extremely anti-Semitic group that's kind of online, and they love to troll. It just it demotivates me from writing that chapter. I'm still going to write it because you need to tell the honest truth. But it's like when you see like nobody can just take a small sip of the drink in front of them, which is the Jewish question, and imbibe carefully and have a mature discussion on it. Need to overdose on it massively to the point that they just begin saying completely ridiculous and absurd things, and that you happen to know, especially if you're from that community. Well, it's like, well, that's not true, and so you don't even want to be associated with any critique at all because you don't want to be lumped in with these clowns. That's kind of the danger on the other end.
Well, and that's been kind of, because, okay, so my particular background, I grew up Dutch Reformed. And so my experience in Reformed, part of our theology has been that God has a special place for the Jewish people, right? So that theology has been, and around those passages in Romans, that he's going to bring in all of his people, including all of the Jews in that sense back. And so that's very much present in Dutch Reformed thinking. And then, my grandparents, they fought in the resistance, they hid Jews. And so all of that is in our experience. And, you layer those kind of things beside, their contempt for the African communities. Like they just sort of, black racism was fine, but, you can't say anything about the Jews because, we hid the Jews. So there's all these weird complexities go along with it. Right. But when you get to here and you get to, 2024 and everything is kind of laid bare and there's all these questions, like you say, can you re-examine, while you're re-examining your political assumptions, is it okay to re-examine your theological assumptions and to question sort of what the kind of things that my grandparents were telling me about the Jewish community? should I just take that lock, stock, and barrel, or should I re-examine that myself? And that's kind of the process that I went through. But like you say, how do you do that without overdosing on the Jewish question and becoming a Groyper? And that was, again, one of the things why I'm glad that you came on to talk about it, right? Because this is sort of the awkward spot that you're put in a sense of like, I want to notice these things. I want to talk about them honestly, but I don't want to be a lunatic in doing so.
Right. Right. And I mean, in many ways, actually, of course, Jewish activists love the Groypers because they're just so discrediting of anybody who would ask questions about any of this. Because they're like, well, okay, if this is of intelligence and analysis and seriousness that you're bringing to it, then obviously the entire enterprise is discredited. And no, I mean, I think it's okay to ask these questions. And again, I don't really believe in Judeo-Christian, like I think America is a Christian nation. It is a nation that's always had Jews in it. And those Jews have had influence and a lot of great influence, sort of dwelling on some of the negative stuff. And I think that's fine because I'm to do that. But there have been a lot of really positive things in that have been brought. So I'm not trying to erase those. But the Christian Zionism, the embrace of really bad dispensationalist theology. I think these have all just been really negative, and they've been very negative for the country in being so tightly tied in with Israel. And again, I say this, I'm actually, just to be clear, I mean, I think I've said it before, like at a basis, like I have a very pro-Israel view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in abstract. I just don't want us involved in it that much. I mean, it's sort of like, between those two groups, I tend to be much more sympathetic with the Israelis, but what I'm not sympathetic to is the amount of time and energy that America spends on this question, often to the detriment of our own national interest. Nor do I accept that, Israel is our greatest ally or the 51st state. And, the amount of attention that's given to somebody like Netanyahu in the U.S., even if I kind of, don't mind him individually, is just very distasteful to me as an American. And so, kind of where I sit again, it's sort of not the easiest.
I tend to be in a similar place to where you are, Jeremy, like in terms of looking at it. That tends to be my bias too, between Israel and the surrounding countries. I tend to have a soft spot for Israel in that regard. But like you said, how much involvement do we need to have over here? How much does America need to really be involved in the Jewish-Palestine conflict in that regard? I guess maybe as one last question, in a sense of what would you hope then that Christians would, take from this, and how do you think, what would be a healthy way in regards, in your sense, if you could say it in a couple lines, for Christians to just kind of help frame their understanding of the sort of the quote unquote Jewish question?
Yeah. Well, I think, everybody, we want to try to make disciples of all the nations, and the Jews are a particularly thorny, thorny problem in that regard. They've been obviously very resistant. If you go back, I mean, it's interesting. This kind of gets into weird bit of Catholic history, but from Saint Teresa of Avila on down, after there was basically mass conversions in Spain in 1492 as a result of Ferdinand and Isabella, kind of finally reunifying Spain and kind of declaring if you were Jewish or Muslim, you needed to either convert or get out. Huge numbers of Jews convert. Their descendants become very disproportionately involved as some of the major kind of Catholic saints and major Catholic religious figures of the 19th century. And so that is all a way of saying, like, there's a lot of value you can get in reaching out to this community that I think has unfortunately lost its way from a logical perspective. And again, I'm not in any way trying to, this is not a like, oh, we're all equal, we're all worshiping the same God. I mean, even in some limited sense, that's true. I mean, no, it's nobody can come to the Father except through me, and I'm not a religious pluralist in that way. But at the same time, you can reach out with compassion. I think setting a good example I think not being afraid to sort of invite people in, because I think there's a lot of people who are disaffected from the community and looking for something different. But at the same time, you kind of have to be a little bit careful of not being overbearing. And then, so that's kind of the individual interaction that I'm talking about. And from a broader question, I would just say, even if you deplore, and I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't, but even if you deplore what you would view as the excessive, influence in social movements in the United States, or even if you think that's particularly pernicious, kind of going the Groyper way is just very self-destructive. And you need to embrace, genuine allies. Because there are, and even, I won't embarrass them or cause them any difficulty by naming them, but I know like multiple Orthodox Jews who I would consider like genuine allies of the conservative movement, not in a neoconservative way, but in a genuinely conservative way, and who actually, even though I obviously feel that they're completely wrong in terms of their religious practice, they're quite loving of the Christian community in terms of their own approach. So, just because somebody's in a community or not, you can't say something about them. You have to treat them as individuals. But I would say we need to be open for embracing allies from that community politically. Mm-hmm. We need to obviously be trying to make disciples of them where we can. We need to unashamedly criticize and critique them when they're enemies without being worried about being called anti-Semites or anything else. We just need to be free to call out bad behavior when we see it, as we would do with any community. But understand that there's, usually not these conspiracies going on. It's just bad behavior, and bad behavior should be called out as bad behavior. And, there's good behavior too. And you want to encourage that and encourage the bad stuff. I think that's kind of where I come down on these things, and that there are members of the Jewish community who can be allies in the political and social movements that we are trying to create. And that doesn't mean that they don't have real logical differences. And it doesn't mean that sometimes these tactical alliances may have limits, where they can't go. But we should embrace folks there, who want to do the right thing. And at the same time, we should not hesitate to be really tough with people who are doing the wrong thing. And if people call us names, Jesus put up with a lot more than that.
Well, and, like you said, like you don't necessarily want to go naming a whole bunch of names, but probably the most prominent one of what we would call our guys, who is Paul Gottfried. And, it just is what it is. Yeah, right. And, absolutely. And Paul Gottfried is not your, like, he's the farthest thing from a neoconservative as you can pretty much get. And like just about everybody roundly in today's conservative movement, with where it's come, everybody's getting the point of like, oh yeah, like Pat Buchanan, like Paul Gottfried was right about everything. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, and he's great. And he's a great example of that. Right. And Paul is actually, I don't know what his current religious practices. I've only met him a couple times in person. But I went to Yeshiva University, which is like the school for Orthodox Jews in New York. He, at least at one point, had a very strong Jewish background and identification, and yet he was absolutely the leader in intellectually, or certainly one of the top ones in the kind of Buchananite, Paulite, whatever you want to call it. And I was in 2008 sort of movement. And so, but he's not the only one of those, right? There's a number of kind of leaders, who I could point to. And I think the danger, again, of growing full Groypers is that you remove allies. And also, I think more importantly for me, from a Christian perspective, we throw away potential converts, because if you kind of have carrot and a stick, and you welcome people in if they're doing the right thing, or they kind of recognize that, we seem to be on the wrong track in some way, and we have open arms for them, we're going to make disciples of the nations. But if we kind of back people into a corner and say, well, because of this 23andMe test you took, you're automatically like a Satanist. Not only is that just theologically incorrect from a
Christian perspective, and I can't stress that enough. But it's really bad from a tactical, strategic perspective politically.
Yeah, no, I would agree wholeheartedly with that, Paul. Oh shoot, my phone that I'm using my camera now has just disappeared, so I'm still here. But anyways, as we're it's probably we're in here about an hour now, and maybe just give you an opportunity. Thank you again for your time. You've written a book recently, and you're doing some stuff, and maybe for my audience that aren't familiar with what you've done, maybe just give a plug for that kind of thing.
Sure. So I wrote a book called The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart, and gotten scores of good reviews from Tucker to Donald Trump Jr. to the American Conservative, and on Amazon you can see them, and it's sold really well. It's in its third printing, and so that's been really gratifying, because I think maybe the reason that I was willing to go on and talk about this, which is kind of a difficult and an uncomfortable subject, is that I've really been dealing with a different difficult and uncomfortable subject for a couple of years now, and so I got used to it. And so, it's been really gratifying, and the reception that book has gotten. You can also follow me on Twitter. My account there is Real Jeremy Carl. And you can follow me on Substack. I have a Substack called The Course of Empire, jeremycarl.substack.com. So you can see what I'm doing there. But really, the book on anti-white racism and kind of addressing anti-white racism has been kind of the main thrust of what I've been doing over the past few years. And again, I mean, I've been overall incredibly gratified with how that book's been received. But yeah, look, I mean, there are a few voices on the far right who say, you're not white, and this is all a conspiracy to, whatever it is. I mean, it's so ridiculous that I can't even deal with it. But, it's just, it's discouraging to see that sort of stuff, because, the two people who know my motivations are myself and God. And it's, I can guarantee you, if you truth quiz both of us, it would not be, my motivations would not be whatever the Groypers and Paulite folk are what they are. But, the good news is those guys are a very small percentage, even if they're very loud, of even folks on the pretty activist right. I mean, again, I've been a Buchananite and a Paulite, et cetera, for quite a long time. And so I'm pretty familiar with the cast of characters, in that world. And again, the overwhelming majority of them have been really supportive of the project and what I'm trying to do, and take it at face value, as they should. So.
Very good. Well, I thank you. And also thank you for writing the book too. As it's one of those things people ask, how are normies getting radicalized, and many, how are they coming to see it? And your book details that in granular detail, but you're just basically saying out loud what a lot of people elsewhere are thinking. Like again, my own son, who's studying to be an engineer, and you try to get a scholarship as, a white kid with good grades, you can just pretty much forget it. Like, there's just no money for you to assist. And we're thankful that God's blessed us and we have the money to help him out. But if that wasn't the case, sorry, you're out of luck. So I'm really glad that someone like yourself is saying these things out loud, because I know there's a lot of people that you meet privately that will say them privately when they feel safe, but don't necessarily feel comfortable enough or safe enough yet to speak them out loud in a public setting.
Well, and that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted it out in a public setting. And I was really gratified for is that while we still got a long way to go, the amount of discussion where I hear the term anti-white racism, even from very mainstream sources, or a number of very mainstream figures, guys Davis Hansen or Chris Rufo, and whoever else, very mainstream conservative figures who are willing to endorse this, and that meant a lot. And that's why I did it, because I certainly didn't do it for my own benefit, but because I felt that it was really important. Truth needed to be out there, and it's in some weird way, it's an analog to why I embraced Christ, because that was the truth and it was out there, and whatever anybody else was going to say about it just was of not any importance compared to that reality.
Awesome. I'm really glad. Again, thank you for coming on and telling your story and talking with the listeners, and hopefully people will really benefit from this. Again, Jeremy, all the best, and take care. And again, glad to have you on.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Seeking the Hidden Thing is delighted to have Axios Fitness Coaching as a sponsorship partner. JD is one of our guys and wants to make you fit for what's coming ahead. He offers a premium resource for holistic strength and conditioning. Axios offers standalone training programs as well as individual coaching options should your needs require something more specific. Click on either the image below or the link in the description. Both I and JD thank you for your support.